The carbine is a light shoulder weapon designed to take the place of the pistol, which is normally carried by officers and service units. It only weighs 5 3/4 pounds, including sling, and a fully loaded 15-round clip. Although smaller and lighter than the M1 rifle, the operation is very similar. The carbine is gas-operated, magazine-fed, and air-cooled. Here's how it works. Before you load, lock the gun with a safety by pushing this button from left to right. Remove the empty magazine, then insert a loaded magazine. Pull the operating slide all the way back and release it. All right, let's go inside where we can use a model and find out what happens. There it is. This is the working model 4 times actual size. When the slide is pulled back, it carries the bolt with it. Let's take a closer look at that. The bolt moves the hammer, and the hammer overrides the sear. Now the sear is free, and its spring forces it into this sear notch, holding the hammer back. Once more, the hammer comes back. It overrides the sear. The sear is forced into the notch, holding the hammer back. Watch it again without the pointer. Then when the slide is released, it carries the bolt forward. Notice that the bolt is pulled by this compressed operating slide spring. As the bolt goes forward, the hammer moves up, forcing the sear back. This compresses the sear spring because the hammer spring is stronger. Now the carbine is cocked. The bolt, in its forward motion, also strips the top cartridge and guides it into the chamber. When the cartridge is nearly seated, the bolt begins to lock. Watch how the cam surface in the operating slide handle acts on the operating lug to rotate the bolt into the locked position. Once more. As the bolt rotates into the locked position, the extractor snaps into the extractor groove on the cartridge. The ejector is forced into the face of the bolt, compressing the ejector spring, and the cartridge is seated. There's one thing more that happens when the bolt locks. Watch the 2 white spots closely. The firing pin tang lines up with a cutout slot in the receiver bridge. Remember, all these separate movements of locking are happening at approximately the same time. Now the carbine is ready to fire. Here's the trigger action. The trigger, as it is pulled, pivots around the trigger pin, forcing the trigger lip up. The lip pushes up on the rear end of the sear, and the sear pivots on the trigger pin. Freeing itself from the hammer. The hammer spring drives the hammer forward. The hammer strikes the firing pin tang. The firing pin is driven through the face of the bolt, igniting the round. The projectile travels along the barrel. and as it passes this gas port, part of the exploding gases escape into the gas cylinder. This gas hits the piston and drives both piston and operating slide to the rear. The piston is stopped by the gas piston nut, but the operating slide continues on. Let's trace the action once more. Gas strikes the piston, forcing it back, and that motion is transmitted to the slide. Now, when the slide is hit and starts back, it moves about 3/8 of an inch before hitting the operating lug. This delay lets the projectile leave the muzzle before unlocking begins. Then, as the cam surface in the operating slide hits the operating lug, the bolt rotates. This unlocks the locking lugs. At the same time, the bolt cams the hammer away from the firing pin tang. This allows the tang to cam against a surface on the receiver bridge, withdrawing the firing pin from the bolt face. Let's watch the whole process now as the bolt unlocks. The hammer moves back, and the firing pin withdraws from the face of the bolt. Now the bolt is free to move, and the operating slide continues back with the bolt. The cartridge case is now withdrawn from the chamber by the extractor. Here it is in animation. It clears the breech, and the ejector springs forward. The case pivots about the extractor and out of the receiver. Now the rear end of the bolt is driving the hammer back. The hammer overrides the sear. The sear is then free, and its spring forces it into the sear notch. Now the bolt goes forward, allowing the hammer to engage the sear, forcing the sear back and compressing the sear spring. Notice that the trigger is all the way back now. Actually, the firing cycle is so fast that the hammer is back before the finger can release the trigger. Therefore, the sear is forced against the trigger lip. Watch that trigger lip. It is forced under the sear by the trigger spring when the trigger is released. Then the sear overrides the trigger lip. The hammer moves up and is held in the cocked position. As the bolt reaches its rear position, the magazine is uncovered. Now watch the magazine follower and spring push a new round up into feeding position. The bolt comes forward, pulled by the operating slide and spring, strips the new cartridge from the magazine, and guides it into the chamber. The bolt is rotated and locked, and unless we're ready to fire, this weapon should now be set on safe. To set the carbine at safe when it's cocked, push the safety from left to right. The trigger won't move. We'll remove the hammer from the model and see just what the safety does. Notice that the trigger moves freely with the safety off. But when the safety is pushed over, it blocks any movement of the trigger, and the weapon is safe. That covers the firing cycle. But let's go over the whole thing once more to make sure you haven't missed anything. Start by locking the gun with a safety. Then insert a loaded magazine. Pull the operating slide back. The gun is now cocked and the slide and bolt move forward.